For me, there are times in life that herald a permanent change. They come as a surprise, often in the form of something ordinary, and alter everything in their path. My stepson Lucas had moved back in a few months prior, and his presence was a constant reminder of the growing void in my marriage to Alexander at the age of 55. Because I had grown accustomed to living alone, even though I shared a home, I had just finished folding a load of laundry on an otherwise typical Tuesday afternoon. Alexander was out on most days for work, so I was able to keep the family looking like a working unit. As I walked down the hallway with the laundry basket tucked under my hip, the shower had been running for a while, but the sound was so muffled that I could hardly hear it. I was distracted when the bathroom door suddenly opened. And there he was. For a moment, neither of us moved as Lucas, fresh from the shower, was sleek and naked in the cold light streaming from the bathroom. My breath caught as I realized what I was seeing, and my eyes instinctively went down before I snapped back up. Lucas's cheeks flushed hot as he quickly turned and reached for the towel he'd left hanging on the bathroom rack. "Oh my God, I forgot my towel," he stammered, his voice stiff with shame. He swiftly wrapped the towel around his waist, and I didn't say anything, even though we both knew it was untrue. I apologized, but I didn't think anybody was listening. I'll just back away and make a vague gesture toward his room. My cheeks burned as I sprinted down the hallway, my heart thumping in my ears, and I spent the rest of the afternoon reliving the incident in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was a silly, embarrassing accident that we would laugh about later, but the truth was that I couldn't get rid of the vision. The tension between us was obvious and undeniable, and it brought with it a surge of confusion for which I was unprepared by the time supper arrived. Lucas avoided eye contact and spoke politely and succinctly, while Alexander talked about his latest business endeavor. Life, I've found, has a way of complicating even the most straightforward situations, and that moment was not easy at all. I, too, kept quiet, my mind racing with ideas that I had no business thinking about. It should have ended there. A short, unpleasant experience that we both eventually forgot. Lucas and I underwent a metamorphosis following that afternoon. For the first few days following the toilet incident, I tried to avoid Dad as much as possible. I limited my tasks to areas of the house where I knew he wouldn't be there, and I avoided going into the living room when he was watching television. However, avoidance made the tension worse. One night, I couldn't sleep and walked into the kitchen at around midnight. The house was dark, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I was startled to hear footsteps as I reached for a glass from the cupboard. Also unable to sleep, behind me, Lucas's voice could be heard. He was standing at the doorway, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair a little mussed after what I assumed was a failed effort at sleep. I turned and gripped the glass like a lifeline. "No," I answered, trying to smile, thinking that some tea may help. With a nod, he stepped forward. "Same here. Do you mind if I join you?" I nodded, hesitantly, but obviously not. Silently, we labored. While I got tea bags out of the cabinet, he filled the kettle for a minute. Lucas leaned against the counter, arms folded, and he began talking quietly as we waited for the water to boil. It seemed strange to be so close to him in the middle of the night, and the anxiety from earlier in the week lingered between us, but neither of us expressed it. I stated right away, "I think we do," to which he replied, "About the other day, I froze holding the edge of the counter. We don't need to discuss. I don't want it to continue since it's been strange ever since." I was surprised by his intensity as I gazed into his eyes for the first time since that day. I said, without raising my voice above a whisper, that it was an accident. "Let's forget that ever happened." He nodded slowly, but his eyes conveyed that he wasn't convinced. During the next several days, I started to notice things about Lucas that I had previously missed, including the smile, when I was absorbed in thinking about how he laughed. I was folding laundry in the living room one evening when he came in and fell onto the couch, his long legs spread out knotted of him. He was not only gorgeous, that was how he carried himself, but he had also gained quiet confidence since his last visit. "Would you like some?" With a nod toward the heap of clothes, he asked for help. I had a chuckle. "Is it even clear to you how to fold a fitted sheet?" It was a brief, harmless moment, but as our hands touched, I felt my breath catch, so I quickly pulled back. "Nope," he responded with a smile, but I can suppose he stepped closer, taking one of the shirts and imitating my movements. "I hope he didn't see you there." "Well," he asked his face. I said, "Furrowed fine, a little too quickly, just fatigued." He didn't press, but his gaze on me lingered long after he had fallen asleep. During breakfast one morning, Alexander announced another work trip. He used a neutral tone, explaining that he would be gone for almost a week without even glancing up. I asked him again from his phone, and he shrugged, trying not to seem relieved. "There is no way to avoid it. I assume you'll be all right here." I took a nod. With Alexander gone, the home seemed different, and my mind was immediately racing. Without him, everything seemed more intimate and silent. That night, as I was sipping wine on the back patio, Lucas joined me. He gestured to the vacant chair next to me with one hand while holding a glass in the other. "Is it okay if I sit?" "Feel free." We sat in cozy silence for a while, both of us smiling despite myself. Lucas said sharply as he watched the fireflies glisten in the hot July wind, "You appear to be happy without Hyun." Shocked, I turned to him. "You mean what?" He took a swig of his drink and shrugged. "I'm not sure when you feel more when it's just the two of us." His comments impacted me, just like they did on you, and I didn't want to define it. "Don't be stupid," I answered, trying to dismiss it with humor. "I'm not kidding." With a gentle yet stern tone, he went on, "You deserve to be happy, Sophia." I looked away from my constricted throat. "It's not that simple. It may be him." Indicated that it occurred late one evening after Alexander had left on his vacation. Lucas and I were in the living room watching a movie when beautiful shadows were created by the screen's illumination. Although none of us moved as the credits rolled, I found myself getting closer to him without realizing it, since the alcohol I had been drinking had made me bolder over the room. I turned to face Lylon as he mumbled something barely audible, my heart pounding. Yes, his eyes were questioning as he stopped. "I'm not sure what it is, but it feels like something." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Instead, I stretched my fingers and brushed on his lips, which shocked me. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in. It was shy at first, a delicate lip-to-lip contact that expressed everything we couldn't say. But as the moment went on, it became evident that there was no turning back. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. I woke up early and waited in my room longer than usual because of the weight of what had happened between Lucas and me, which was like a heavy blanket. What can I say? Pacing and preparing my words for when I meet him. Even as I thought about it, I knew it wasn't true. The memory of the previous night was still too clear, full of a kind of intensity I hadn't felt in years. When I finally left, I found Lucas in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Was it a mistake, MAK, that it wouldn't happen again? When I got there, his expression was unfathomable as he glanced up. "Good morning," he replied drowsily. I replied in the morning, avoiding his gaze as I was tending to the kettle. The tension between us was evident as we stood in silence for a minute before he eventually spoke. "What about you, Sophia?" he whispered quietly. "We shouldn't have talked about it last night," I murmured suddenly, my tone harsher than I meant it to be. He put down his cup and stared at me. Was that my heart pounding and I froze? "I know, this is not right," he whispered. His comments lingered in the air, and for a moment I considered turning and walking away. But I decided against it. This is not to say that it had no meaning. I vowed to keep our distance from one another, but Lucas and I were drawn to one another in ways that felt inevitable. The glances were brief at first, as well as subtle, lingering touches, but it didn't take long for those things to go south. One evening, while I was folding clothes, he entered the living room and sat next to me, allowing me to help him. He offered to grab a stack of towels, but I told him not to. "I want to," I said, in spite of my hesitation. He spoke in tones. Stiff, we worked in silence for a while, but when our hands touched, I could tell that he was watching me. His face was unbreakable, and his eyes were fierce. I started to say, "Lucas," but stopped myself. He gave me a kiss while leaning in. It was different, more deliberate, even than the previous evening. I did not stop him, even though my entire rational side screamed that it was wrong. The ensuing days were filled with secrets and stolen moments. We became experts at roving. Finding quiet times together and avoiding suspicion were made easier by Alexander's constant absence. But the thrill of our affair was marred by a constant feeling of dread. Every creak in the floorboards and every sudden noise seemed like a potential danger while Alexander was away. After making the decision to take a drive, Lucas and I arrived at a secluded park outside of town, where we found a serene spot under the shade of a massive oak tree. Ever wonder what may occur if we were discovered? "Of course," he said, turning to face me as I lay in the grass next to him, "but I also know I don't want to stop his honesty." His candor left me stunned, and for the first time, I let myself admit that I did not want to stop the first cracks in our fragile bubble that appeared when my best friend Camilla dropped by out of the blue one day. "Camilla," I yelled, taken aback by her sudden arrival. "I had no idea you were approaching. The neighborhood was where I was." "It's been too long," she continued, hurrying past me into the home. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you were doing." She found Lucas in the kitchen, and I saw a shocked expression on his face. Ed glanced at Camilla and said, "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." "Here are Lucas and myself. Alexander's son," she continued hastily, trying to conceal my uneasiness, raising an eyebrow and smiling knowingly. "Well, the prodigal stepson is back. Lucas, it's good to meet you," he replied. "You too," in a polite but wary manner. As the afternoon wore on, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that Camilla was observing me too closely, her sharp eyes glancing at every detail. A few days later, Lucas's friend Ryan stopped by without warning. Ryan, who leaned against the doorframe, was tall and wiry and had a quick smile that hardly reached his eyes. He continued, "Just thought I'd check in. You haven't been around much lately." After giving me a quick look, Guy Lucas went outside with me. I watched them talk through the glass, their voices lively but low enough that I couldn't understand them. When Lucas came back inside, his manner was tense. "Why was that?" "What?" I inquired. As we sat in the living room later that evening, he told me the truth. "Nothing," he said, dismissing me. "What?" Ryan asked. My breath caught. "What have you said, and is there anything private going on between us?" Of course, I told him wrong. His tone was protective, he claimed, but I don't think he believes me. When I learned this, I felt a shudder go through me, since our secret looked more vulnerable than ever, and the possibility of revelation was higher than ever. Alexander had unexpectedly returned home one Sunday morning, saying he wanted to spend the weekend with his family. We acted like a normal family, with Lucas relaxing on the couch, looking through his phone, and Alexander reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. However, as I reached for a dish from the cupboard, Alexander looked up suddenly. This was the closest we came to being caught. "A lot of time has been spent here lately, don't you think?" Lucas added casually, "Get to see friends and have a life." Lucas looked at me and then answered. Alexander took a call in the study and nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. Alexander was only trying to save some money till I worked things out. Lucas came up to me. "We must exercise greater caution," he whispered in an angry tone. "I understand." I responded, my voice scarcely audible. I'll manage, but I was wondering how long we could keep our secret even as I said it. Alexander unexpectedly returned home after another brief trip. When the front door opened that morning, the house was quiet, Lucas in his bed, and me taking advantage of a rare moment of tranquility on the back porch. As I entered the house, I was taken aback by the typical Greek Alexander. I call Alexander.g his briefcase, and untying his tie, he muttered in amazement. My pulse raced, but I forced a smile on my face, since I chose to return and spend the weekend with you, because I finished early. That's excellent. You ought to have given me a call so I could have ordered dinner. He waved me away. It's not necessary. Although I'm happy to be home, his presence made the house feel heavier and brought back memories of the unpleasant conversation Lucas and I had during dinner that evening. Ever the strict one, Alexander was prepared to ask Lucas about his goals, so he started cutting into his steak. Lucas, what's next for you? It's been a while since you were here. Do you think it's time to begin making choices, Lucas? Furious, he put down his fork. You know, Dad, I've been looking for jobs. It's not a quick fix. Alexander said, raising an eyebrow. You may have achieved more success. Alexander, I would have stepped in and spoken tougher if you hadn't been lazing about the house all day. More than I had thought. Hune has been lending a hand around the house as well. Give him credit. The silence that ensued was shattered, with Alexander's eyes darting to mine, his expression unclear. As if the tension with Alexander wasn't enough, the following week brought Vanessa, Lucas's ex-girlfriend, who arrived on a Saturday. Lucas gave me a quick glance, and I realized we'd need to be more cautious. He finally acknowledged that his tone was laid back, but with an edge that I couldn't ignore. And I was abruptly interrupted from a quiet time in the kitchen by her knock on the door. When I opened the door, I saw a tall, confident woman with blonde hair. She said sweetly, "Hello. Is Lucas home?" I froze for a second before moving aside. "He's upstairs. I'll let him know. You've arrived." Lucas's response to seeing her was one of astonishment and displeasure. "Vanessa, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you," she murmured. Shoving past him into the living room, we haven't spoken since. Well, everything. I hovered in the kitchen, pretending not to hear while their talk continued. "You can't simply show up like this," Lucas remarked, marking his voice low but forceful. "Why not?" She shot back. "When we were together, you didn't appear to respect limits." When she left an hour later, her final remarks to him sent a shiver down my spine. "Lucas, I'll see you soon, whether you like it or not." Elisa's intuition was typically keen, and my recent actions had not escaped her notice when she asked me out for coffee one morning. I knew she had something in mind. "You've been distracted recently," she explained, swirling her cappuccino. "Just busy," I said, averting her more. "Look," she leaned forward, her voice lowering. "Margot, I know you better than that. That's what's actually going on." I hesitated, torn between telling her and keeping the secret that had come to define my existence. Finally, I settled for half the truth. It's Alexander. I announced he's been more critical recently, and I feel like I can't do anything correctly. Camilla frowned. "And how does Lucas fit into this?" My heart races with Faye. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you two seem closer than I recall you being." Previously, I attempted a laugh, attempting to distract. "He's simply been around more recently. It's hard not to bond when you live together all the time." Camilla didn't appear persuaded, but she put the topic aside for the moment. Vanessa arrived a few days later. Finding Lucas in the driveway while he worked on his car, I observed from the window as their talk heated up, her hands moving madly as she approached him. Finally, I could not take it anymore. I went outdoors, my heart thumping. "Is everything okay out here?" I inquired of my voice, calm yet forceful. Vanessa turned to me, her gaze narrowing. "Oh, Margot, I did not see you." Then Lucas warned Vanessa that this is not the time. "Oh, I believe it is the ideal moment," she added, crossing her arms. Margot, Lucas has been holding some fascinating secrets. Recently, perhaps you'd want to hear about them. My blood was chilly, but I faked a grin. I'm not sure what you're saying, but I believe it's time for you to leave. She kept my eyes for a time before ultimately giving in fine. But it's not over as she went away. I looked at Lucas. What exactly did she intend by that she's trying to cause trouble? He muttered, his jaw tightening. Do not let her get to you. But the warning in her voice lasted long after she left. Alexander's conduct got increasingly irregular as the days passed. He began asking more specific questions about how I spent my time and where Lucas was during the day. One evening, when we were sitting in the living room, he quickly turned to me. Margot, have you observed anything weird? About Lucas, recently I froze, attempting to maintain a neutral look. How unusual is this? He shrugged his eyes, piercing. I do not know, he simply appears different. In fact, how do you do as well, Alexander? I'm not sure what you're suggesting, I responded cautiously. I'm not insinuating anything, he added, but his tone suggested otherwise. The tension between us had become intolerable. I was aware that a critical moment was imminent when Camilla arrived. At home, unexpectedly one day, I should have realized something was amiss. I need to speak with you, she continued, her look serious. I walked her into the living room, my nerves on edge. What's happening? I asked. She hesitated before saying, I believe Alexander deserves to know what's going on. My stomach sank. Camilla, you cannot, she interjected. I am. Doing this for you is not healthy, Margot. It will ruin you if you do not put an end to it. Before I could react, she rose up and walked towards the door. Please, Camilla, I called after her, but she did not glance back that night. Alexander addressed me. Camilla had gone directly to him and spilled all she suspected to Vrokh. Is this true? He demanded, his voice trembling with wrath. Alexander, I can explain, I started, but he cut me off. Not lie to me, Margot. I need the truth. I immediately opened my lips, but no words emerged. The truth loomed heavily between us. It's impossible to refute. Alexander's face contorted in wrath. Get out, he said. Pack your belongings and depart. I don't want to find you here when I wake up. When Alexander told me to go, I felt like the earth beneath me had collapsed. The life I had painstakingly established, the home I had diligently cared for. Everything seemed strange that night. I packed a tiny suitcase, my hands quivering as I put clothes and necessities inside. Lucas entered my room, his face pale and tense with fury. What's happening? He inquired, his voice low. Alexander knows, I responded, my voice trembling. Camilla informed him. Lucas clenched his jaw and began pacing. She had no rights. How could she? It doesn't matter now, I said, sitting on the side of the bed. I need to leave. No, he answered, pausing in his tracks. We can work this out. I'll speak with him. You cannot solve this, Lucas, I replied, tears welling up in my eyes. He will not forgive me or you. Lucas kneeled before me, his hands clutching mine. I will not allow you to go through this alone. We'll depart, together if necessary. However, as soothing as his words were, they did not alleviate the dread that was building in my gut. The next morning I booked into a tiny hotel on the outskirts of town, trying to escape additional conflict while deciding what to do next. But as I sat on the uncomfortable bed, looking at the peeling wallpaper, my phone vibrated with a text. It came from Vanessa. You should have known this would not go well. Check your inbox. My blood became chilly. I rushed to open my laptop, my hands trembling as I signed into my account. There it was, an email from an unexpected address with the subject line, You can't. My heart pounded as I clicked it open. Attached were blurry but incriminating photographs of Lucas and myself together, in times that left no room for interpretation. A statement accompanied the photographs, telling Lucas to comply, or these will get to Alexander and everyone else who cares. I dialed Lucas immediately, my voice shaking. Vanessa has photographs, I added, my words coming out quickly. What, he inquired, his voice tight with skepticism. She sent them to me and threatened to give them to Alexander. There was a lengthy wait on the other end of the telephone before he spoke. We cannot let her do this. We must stop her. How? I inquired. Desperation clear, he said. I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. Later that evening, Alexander called me. His voice was cool, controlled, and terrifyingly calm. I want you to return to the home tomorrow, he said. Why? I asked. Cautiously, because we all need to talk. The connotation was plain: Lucas would be there too. I remained in a state of dread for the rest of the night, mentally reliving all the worst-case scenarios. The following afternoon, I returned to the house. The air inside was thick with anxiety as Alexander led me into the living room where Lucas was already waiting. Alexander stood with his arms folded and looked at the two of us. "So, here's how this is going to go," he explained. "You are both going to tell me the truth. No more falsehoods, no more evasions." Lucas spoke first, and his voice was steady. "It's not as you think, Alexander," interrupted him with a harsh laugh. "Not what I thought, Lucas. I have eyes. I've seen how you both gaze at each other." I tried to intervene, but Alexander's attention was drawn to me and you, he said, his voice full of hate. "I trusted you. I married you, so this is how you reward me." The room grew hushed, the weight of his words bearing down on all of us. Finally, Lucas ended the stillness. "We made a mistake," he said calmly. "However, it isn't as straightforward as you believe." "Oh, it's simple," Alexander exclaimed. "You have both deceived me." The doorbell rang before the conflict could develop any further. Alexander stormed out to answer it, and he returned seconds later with Vanessa. "What's she doing here?" Lucas demanded, his voice tinged with rage. Alexander narrowed his brows as he replied, "She says she has something to share." Vanessa moved forward, a smug look on her lips. I felt it was time for everyone to know the truth. She took out her phone and showed Alexander the images she'd sent me. His face became ashen as he scanned through them. "Indeed," he said, his voice hardly audible above a whisper. Vanessa smiled wider. "Oh, that is true, but I am willing to make it all go away for the proper price." "Are you blackmailing us?" Lucas asked incredulously. "I like to think of it as reimbursement for the emotional harm you've done," she replied softly. Alexander's attention went to her and his demeanor hardened. He replied, "Get out of my..." Vanessa blinked, evidently unprepared for his reply. "What you heard me say," he replied, raising his voice. "Get out before I called the cops for the first time." She stumbled, but she immediately recovered. "Okay," she murmured, heading toward the door. "But don't think it's over." Vanessa went, and the home slipped into an eerie quiet. Alexander slumped down, hard in his chair, scratching his temples. "I can't believe that," he mumbled. "Alexander." I started, but he held out a hand to stop me. "I don't want to hear it," he said. "Not right now." Lucas stood with a stiff stance. "This is my fault," he admitted to you. "Shouldn't blame her for it." "It is both of your faults," Alexander snapped and cut him off. However, just as the tension reached its peak, Camilla casually entered. "Believe you've had enough drama for one day," she replied quietly, holding a folder. Alexander spoke bitterly to Camilla. "Unless you're here to solve this disaster, I recommend you go." She held up the packet. "That is exactly why I am here." She handed it to Alexander, who opened it with caution. Inside were records revealing Vanessa's history of deception and manipulation, including her most recent effort to blackmail another family. Camilla responded, "She is no longer your problem. I've already submitted this to someone who can handle it." Alexander gazed at her, astonished. "Why are you supporting us?" "Because," she explained, staring at me. "Sometimes people make errors and deserve a second opportunity." The home seemed claustrophobic in the days following Vanessa's unsuccessful blackmail attempt. Alexander had gone to his study, casting a huge shadow over every area. Lucas and I avoided being alone. Together, a solemn realization that anything more would just make matters worse, but the silence was deceiving. I sensed the simmering turmoil beneath the surface. Camilla broke the quiet first. She called me early one morning, her voice brisk. "Margot, you should meet me," she said. Now I inquired, my voice still heavy with sleep. "Yes," she urged, "this cannot wait." Camilla had picked a modest cafe on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, she was already waiting. A warm cup of coffee was in front of her. "Thank you for coming," she murmured as I sat down. "What is this about?" I inquired, my nerves already on edge. She slipped a manila envelope across the table. "I investigated more into Vanessa's connections. After last week," she explained, "and I discovered something you won't like." My gut twisted as I opened the letter and read the contents of bank statements, emails, and a series of SMS messages. Camilla spoke quietly, saying she had been in contact with Alexander for months. I believe she planned this from the beginning. The understanding hit me like a blow in the stomach. Vanessa hadn't simply been causing issues out of spite. She'd been collaborating with Alexander when I got home. Alexander was in the living room drinking whiskey. He looked up as I went in, his expression inscrutable. "We need to talk," I remarked. My voice harsher than I thought, he motioned toward the chair opposite him. "Go ahead." I tossed the envelope on the table between us. "How long have you worked with Vanessa?" His eyes squinted as he looked at the documents. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Do not lie to me, Alexander," snapped Camilla. "Discovered everything in the texts and money transfers you brought her into our lives to do your nasty task." He placed down his drink, moving slowly and deliberately. "Okay," he murmured, reclining back in his chair. "I contacted her after becoming aware of the situation between you and Lucas. I hoped she could help me figure out the truth." "And blackmailing us," I demanded, "was that also part of your plan?" "That wasn't intended to happen," he explained, his voice frigid. "She went renegade. But don't behave like a victim here, Margot. You are the one that deceived me." His remarks wounded me, but I wouldn't back down. "Alexander, you've set this family on fire for. Instead of speaking with me, you resorted to someone similar to her. We were talking to you," he screamed, his voice rising. "How could I talk to you when you were sneaking around behind my back with my own son?" The room went quiet as the weight of his allegation became too much as the fight heated up. Lucas entered the room. His demeanor furious, he inquired, "What's happening?" His voice was harsh. "Your mother," Alexander spit, "accuses me of conspiring with Vanessa to derail your little plan." Lucas's eyes moved to me and then back to Alexander. "Is this true?" Silence provided all the confirmation we required. Lucas clenched his hands at his sides. "You had no rights. You had no right to touch her," Alexander fired back. "But here we are before one of us could stop him." Lucas moved closer to Alexander, his voice shaking with rage. "Do you believe you are blameless in all of this? You ignored her. You treated her like a prop in your ideal little existence. Do not pretend like you are the victim here." Alexander arose, his face flushed with wrath. "Get out of my home now," Lucas said, his voice calm now. "Get out." The tension snapped like a taut rope. Alexander. Surging forward, his fist landed on Lucas's jaw with a terrible thump. I yelled, jumping between them as Lucas lurched backwards. "Stop it," I yelled, pressing against Alexander's chest. "Stay out of this," Margot snarled. Lucas wiped the blood off his lip, his eyes burning. "Do you think beating me is going to solve anything?" Alexander raised a shaky finger at him. "You are not my son. You never were. You're just a selfish young guy who wrecked everything." The words remained in the air. Lucas's shoulders fell, the fight fading from him. "You're correct," he said gently. "I am not your son, and I do not want to be." He turned and went out the door, leaving Alexander and me standing in the ruins of what was once a family house that felt eerily silent in the days that followed. Alexander entered the guest room, his presence a stark reminder of what we'd lost. Lucas did not return, and the vacuum he left behind was oppressive. Camilla checked in on me, clearly concerned. "How are you holding up?" she asked, inquired on the phone one evening. "I'm not sure I admitted everything. To be falling apart, you'll get through it," she said. "But you have to pick what you want, Margot. You cannot continue to live this way." Her remarks stuck with me. Long after we had hung up, a week later I packed my luggage for the second time. Alexander was in his study as I approached the doorway. "I'm leaving," I announced. He looked up at his face, haggard. "Where will you go?" "I'm not sure yet," I admitted, "but I cannot remain here." He nodded, his gaze returning to the papers on his desk. "What you need to know is that as I drove away from the house, I had an odd combination of melancholy and relief. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had power over my own life. That evening, I arrived at a motel, my mind racing as I nestled into my strange room. My phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "I apologize for everything. Please, let me know if you ever want to chat." It came from Lucas. I glanced at the message. For a long time before responding, perhaps someday, for the time being, I needed to reconnect with myself.